Arratsaldeon eta ongi etorrizek mintegira unkur.
Good afternoon or good evening, and welcome to all of those who are joining us today, both in person and online, for this last session of the Permanent Ordinary Seminar. Well, I'm Miren Jayo, and this is Beatriz Cavia and Leire Vergara, and all three of us are members of the Bulegoa Zenbaki Barik Office Without a Number organization. The Permanent Ordinary Seminar is a series of public talks organized jointly by Bulegoa Zenbaki Barik and Sociología Ordinaria, Ordinary Sociology. We began in December last year, and today is the 6th and unfortunately, sadly, the last session. But it's an enormous pleasure for us to round off the series with a talk by Sara Ahmed and comments from Laura Muelas and Leire San Martin. Sara will be joining us online, and Laura and Leire are here with us at the Bulegoa Zenbaki Barik in our offices in Bilbao. Now, I know that many of you, especially those joining us online, may not be familiar with Bulegoa Zenbaki Barik and Sociología Ordinaria. So, just for you, very quickly, let me tell you that Bulegoa Zenbaki Barik is a space established in Bilbao by 4 women in 2010. It's an office that focuses on art and knowledge, and Sociología Ordinaria is, among other things, a research group set up in 2014 in Madrid by Elena Casado, Antonio García, and Amparo Lassen. And it's based on the concept of ordinario, which is a polysemous term in Spanish, which in addition to ordinary also means vulgar or coarse. So I'm going to pass the floor over to my colleague. Thank you very much, Miren. Many thanks to everyone here today. Both of you, both those who are here with us at Bulegoa and those who are joining us online. Very special word of thanks, of course, to our guests this evening, Sara Ahmed, Leire San Martin, and Laura Muelas. And also our technicians, Silvia Coppola and Javier Rodriguez, without whom none of this would have been possible. And of course, to our 3 interpreters who are going to be translating into English, Basque, and Spanish, Maria Colera, Mayer Villar, and Diana Draper. At the end of the presentation and the comments, we're going to have a Q&A session with the audience. So if you want to ask a question, there are 2 ways to do so. You can either do it through the chat function on the platform, or you can simply raise your hand digitally, of course. And in that case, we will pass you the floor and you can turn on your video and you can talk live. And those of you who are here, of course, we will give you the floor if you'd like. We'd also like to remind you that there is simultaneous interpreting available into Spanish, English, and Basque. If you'd like to access this service, you can do so over the platform. You just have to click on the interpreting option and then choose one of the language channels. And finally, we would like to let you know that the session, after the end of the session will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. So without further ado, not to take up too much more of your time, I'm going to pass the floor to our colleagues from Sociología Ordinaria, Amparo Lassen, Antonio García, and Elena Casado, who will be introducing our guests this evening. They're in Madrid. Amparo, the floor is all yours. Good afternoon. Arratsaldeon. So this is the 6th and last session of our Permanent Ordinary Seminar series. I would like to thank all of those involved. They've been really interesting sessions, very informative sessions, not without their difficulties, of course, but we're going to round them off in the perfect way. And we're all delighted that we have Sara Ahmed with us and also our other 2 guests, Laura and Leire, to finish off this session. Let me very briefly introduce you to all 3 of them. Now, I'm sure they need no introduction because I'm sure they're very, very well known. And as you know, the title of today's event is Complaint as Feminist Pedagogy. And Laura and Leire are going to be talking about something similar as well, about activism, about the whole idea of complaining especially in the heart of institutions. So Sara has this wonderful ability to create concepts, to create figures and characters with whom we can identify. The Killjoy feminist blog as well as what she blogs on, this whole idea of being a Killjoy feminist. We can all identify with that. And every time we complain, we do feel that this is how we're being cast. So this figure is something I think is a figure that we really identify with. Now, Sara Ahmed needs very little introduction, because I think that the response to this event really speaks for itself. She's a feminist, an independent feminist scholar and writer. She's a feminist killjoy, as in fact the title of her blog indicates. She's written a number of books that have been extremely useful for us in our research and as our work as feminists as well. It opens up a lot of possibilities for us. It gives us new ideas. Many of these texts have in fact been translated into Spanish. Queer feminology, orientations, objects, and others, for example, has been translated, and that's great because it helps us really in our work. And in these books, there's many ideas and concepts that we're going to hear about today, talking about power relations, the power networks, especially in the institutions in which we spend a lot of our time. Now, after Sara speaks, we're going to be hearing from Leire, San Martin, and Laura Muelas, who organize the Feministaldia Festival in San Sebastian. Laura is an anthropologist, and she's currently writing her doctoral thesis on an issue which I think is great, which is feminist practices around pleasure. I think that's a great issue, a great topic. And Leire San Martin works in the field of education and programming in the field of contemporary art practices. She's currently head of the mediation department in the Tabacalera Contemporary Center for Contemporary Culture. And if you look on the Bulegoa website, you can see a number of her references of the works that she has written. So I think that's all from me. I'm going to pass the floor straight over to Sara Ahmed, and then we'll be hearing from Leire and Laura. So without further ado, Sara, the floor, well, the screen rather, is yours.
Thank you for that introduction to the series as well as to today. And before I begin, I would like to thank everyone involved in organising this event for all the work that's gone into making it happen, and also to ensuring that the lecture can be translated into Spanish and Basque. And thanks to everyone who's listening for your time and for your attention, for being our feminist ears. Using complaints to challenge abuses of power and institutional hierarchies is hard and costly work. In universities, this work is often, I have learnt, undertaken by students and early career lecturers, in other words, precarious workers. And I would like to dedicate this lecture to all of you for all that you do. So I'm just going to share my screen. So today I'll be sharing stories of making complaints at universities. Let me start with a story. I'm talking to a postgraduate student about her experience of making a complaint about gender-based harassment and bullying. She has started the process by communicating her intent to complain to the chair of her department. From him, she receives a warning articulated obliquely as an expression of concern for her career. His response was essentially, well, we're just thinking about your career. How will this affect you in the future? She begins to feel a shift, the withdrawal of support. Just by saying I wanted to file a complaint, I sensed I was being treated differently. She wasn't sure whether to go through with the complaint because of what she was being told, that to complain would compromise her position, indeed her career. Complaints are often treated as sticky data. It is as if they will stick to you and you fear, or you are taught to fear, that that's how you will end up getting stuck. Toward the end of her story, she told me about another student who had complained before
que
her.
había presentado una queja antes que ella,
Ikasle batez hitz egin zidan. Beste
y estaba marginada, nadie se acercaba a ella. Y añadió, la gente me contó la historia, es muy difícil de asimilar porque en ese momento estaba tan dispuesta a seguir adelante.
That if I were to move forward, I would likely be experiencing some of the same things she did. She recognizes that to go forward with a complaint will be to go through what the woman before her went through. To go forward is to go back. And now there I am. And so she came to see through it, a story she'd been willing to go along with about a woman who had complained before. If a story can be inherited as distance, no one goes near her. A complaint can give you proximity, an unwilled proximity to those who've been cast out. To make a complaint can be thus how we acquire skepticism towards stories told about complainers, stories that are rarely told from the complainer's point of view. Today, I'll be sharing stories of complaint from the point of view of those who have made them. Since June 2017, I've been talking to academics and students who've made complaints at universities relating to abuses of power or to challenging unequal or unjust working conditions. And I need you to know before I share these stories that many of them are painful and traumatic. These are difficult stories to share, and I'm aware they may be difficult to hear, so please do take care of yourselves in listening to them. My project on complaints at the university is also on the university. And by on the university, I do not just mean that the university is my research site, although it is that. I mean that my project is about the effort to transform universities. I was inspired by my experience of supporting a collective complaint about sexual misconduct and sexual harassment that was lodged by PhD students where I used to work. Leila Whitney, Tiffany Page, Alice Corbell, with support from Heidi Hasbrook, Christa Sodrolia and others, wrote one of the two conclusions of my book about the work they began whilst they were students. To write about the work is to continue the work, and can I thank all of them, each of them, for that work. In the project, I'm also indebted to critiques of diversity and the university offered by Black feminists and feminists of colour, such as Jackie Alexander, Surma Bilga, Heidi Mirza, Chandra Talpe Mahanti, Melinda Smith, Shirley Ann Tate, and Gloria Becker. I think of their combined work as counter-institutional. They teach us how universities work, for whom they work, for whom they don't work. Counter-institutional work in feminist hands is often housework, with all the drudgery and repetition that that word implies, painstaking work, administrative work, and also care work. Because if we need to transform institutions to survive them, we still need to survive the institutions we are trying to transform. Complaint as feminist pedagogy. To make a complaint within an institution is to learn about the institution, how they work, what I often call institutional mechanics. To tell the story of a complaint made within an institution can be then to tell another story about the institution. And that story often counters the institution's story, that is, the story it tends to tell about itself. So on paper, this is the institution's story. A complaint might look rather like this. It's a flowchart with straight lines and pointy arrows giving the would-be complainer a clear route through. Things are not always as they appear on paper. I look at this complaint's procedure and I see diversity. Diversity is papering over the cracks. Diversity is smoothing out in appearance. The problem of procedures is not simply that they don't tend to determine what happens. Procedures can also be used to stop complaints. So in other words, a story is also a technique. One academic describes, I had to push them because according to their procedure, there were so many days you had after submitting the complaint for it to be investigated. She has to keep pushing them to follow their own procedure because otherwise her complaint will be dropped in accordance with their procedure. Many complaints I have learned are dropped on procedural grounds because those who complain do not submit the right forms to the right people in the right way at the right time. So the narrowing of the complaint as a genre is how many struggles are not recorded. But even complaints that assume at some point the form of a formal complaint begin long before the use of a procedure. Another story. A lecturer is returning after long-term sick leave. She is neuroatypical. She needs time, she needs space to return to her work, to do her work. But if she has to complain to get more time, her complaint takes up more and more of her time. She describes, there are like 4 channels of complaint going on at the same time. But interestingly, none of these people seem to be crossed over. You do complaint at different times, emails, phone calls, occupational health, the union. It is generating all this material and all this paperwork, but nothing seems to shift. It's just a file, actually. I'll return to how complaints end up as or in files in due course. With all these channels of communication being open up at the same time, it is a mess. There's so much material. So complaints are experienced less as a flow, away we go, and rather more like this. There's so much paper, so many conversations, crossed wires. And despite that, all of that work, nothing seems to shift. So it's worth noting here that a complaint can be an expression of grief, pain, or dissatisfaction, something that is the cause of a protest or outcry, a bodily ailment, or a formal allegation. And the latter sense of complaint as formal allegation also brings up these other more affective and embodied senses. In making a complaint, you often have to become expressive. The word express comes from press, to press out. And each time the early lecturer tries to express her complaint, she encounters a wall. She speaks to a physician from occupational health, and she has to complain about how he tries to express her complaint for her. He was shocked that I complained to him in the room face to face. He was dictating the letter to the computer, which was automatically typing it. And I think he was astonished that I said, I'm not going to sign it. I think of her refusal to sign that letter, to agree with how he expressed her complaint back to her, the words he reads out loud, his words, the computer automatically typing those words, his words, the different ways that you can be made to disappear from your own story. To go through a formal complaint process is often then to be channeled in a certain direction. You know, to how the institution channels your complaint, no to how it records your no. And sometimes it can be hard to keep saying no. Perhaps you don't feel you have a right to keep saying it. She describes, there is something else which is something to do with being a young female academic from a working class background. Part of me felt that I wasn't entitled to make the complaint, that this is how hard it is for everybody, and this is how hard it should be, how hard it is, how hard it should be. To question one's entitlement to complain can be to question whether one has the right to expect anything other than more of the same, how hard it is, as how hard it should be. So if part of her felt she wasn't entitled to complain, she has to fight against that part of herself, that inheritance of a classed as well as gendered history. She has to fight to express her complaint in her own terms, just as she has to fight for what she needs to do her work. She describes what it's like to do that work. It was like a little bird scratching away at something, and it wasn't just really having any effect. It was just really small, 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 and behind closed doors. I think people maybe feel that because of the nature of the complaint and you're off work, so they have to be polite and not talk about it. And so much of their politeness is because they don't want to say something. And maybe it is to do with being in an institution and the way they are built, long corridors, doors with locks on them, windows of blinds that come down. It seems to sort of imbue every part of it with a cloistered feeling. There is no air. It feels suffocating. It was like, note this it. A complaint is something you are doing can acquire exteriority, becoming a thing in the world, scratching away, a little bird, all your energy going into an activity that matters so much to what you can do and who you can be, but barely seems to leave a trace the more you try. The smaller it becomes, the smaller you become, smaller and smaller still. I think of those birds, I hear those birds scratching away. And I also think of diversity work, described to me by one practitioner as a banging your head against a brick wall job. When the wall keeps its place, it is you that gets sore. And what happens to the wall? All you seem to have done is scratch the surface, scratching away at something. Scratching gives you a sense of the limits of what you can accomplish. Note as well how a complaint becomes almost like a magnifying glass. So much appears, so many details can be picked up by an attention, the geography of a place, the building, the long corridors, the locked doors, the windows of blinds that come down, less light, less room, you cannot breathe, suffocating. When you have to fight for room, you can become more conscious of just what little room you have. That's why I describe complaint as a kind of phenomenology of the institution. I was struck by how often doors in particular came up in her testimony, as well as in the testimony of others. She herself used doors, she referred to doors 7 times. She also describes, I was just frightened and I just allowed myself to go through it very privately. And I hit all those doors along the way and just came out very guarded by it. So it's telling us something, that doors are everywhere in this data. We're more likely to notice doors when we hit them rather than enter them. Doors are not just physical things that swing on hinges, although they are that. They are also mechanisms that enable an opening or a closing. So when a path is no longer available to us, a door becomes a figure of speech. We say, that door is closed. So doors can be, to borrow from Audre Lorde, the master's tools, teaching us how the same house is being built, how only some can enter, how others become trespassers. So from complaint, we learn how the house is built. In my book, What's the Use? On the Uses of Use, I use this image as an image of queer use, how things can be used in ways that were not intended or by those for whom they were not intended. I think of these birds rather affectionately as our queer kin. They turn a small opening intended for letters into a door, a queer door perhaps, a way of getting in and out of the box. Of course, the postbox can only become a nest if it stops being used as a postbox, hence the sign, please don't use, addressed to would-be posters of letters. I'm aware this is a rather happy and hopeful image. It is rare that we can just turn up and turn a box into a nest or a room into a shelter to queer use, for some to take up residence in spaces not intended for them, often, usually requires a world dismantling effort. And by complaint, I think we're describing some of that effort. So a complaint can be the effort to be accommodated. An academic describes how she has to keep pointing out that the rooms are inaccessible because they keep booking rooms that are inaccessible. She has to keep saying it because they keep doing it. I worry about drawing attention to myself. But this is what happens when you hire a person in a wheelchair. There have been major access issues at the university. She spoke of the drain, the exhaustion, the sense of why should I have to be the one who speaks out? You have to speak out because others do not. And because you speak out, others can justify their own silence. They hear you. So it becomes about you. Major access issues become your issues. Structures are often treated as issues made personal. So if you can't get into the room, the problem is you. Those of us who have issues, we often end up on the diversity committee. The more issues you have, the more committees you end up on. But even these committees can be occupied in the same old ways. A woman of colour academic describes, I was on the equality and diversity group in the university, and as soon as I started mentioning things to do with race, they changed a portfolio of who could be on the committee, and I was dropped. You just have to say the word race and you'll be heard as complaining. Histories keep repeating themselves. Another time she's writing a paper for a special issue of a journal on decolonising her discipline. She receives feedback from a white editor. The response of the editor was, needs to be toned down, not enough scholarly input to back up the claims they're making. Basically, get back in your box. And if you want to decolonise, we'll do it on our terms. Being dropped from the diversity committee for mentioning things to do with race is continuous. We're being told to tone it down on the decolonising special issue. So whiteness can be just as occupying of issues or spaces when they are designated diverse or decolonial. What happens if you raise issues on these issues? She describes, whenever you raise something, the response is, you're not one of them. Not one of them. A complaint seems to amplify what makes you not fit, picking up on what you are not. A complainer becomes a stranger, a foreigner, a trespasser. So a complaint then can be used as evidence that you're not from here or that you're not meant to be here. A PhD student objects to how a lecturer is communicating with her. We would call this an informal complaint. He is overly intimate. He had sent her an email from a private Hotmail account and suggested that they meet up during this or next weekend in the evening. She communicates to him that she finds his style of communication inappropriate, and this is his response written down as an email. As for meeting in the evening and its combination with my personal email, this is how we do it here at the department, ask our MA students. Perhaps your department has some other norm which I do not understand. Also, your religion might be a problem. So note the assertion of how we do things here as an answer to a questioning of how he is doing things here. Note the interpolation of other students into their assertion. Note the implication that a complaint is simply about a difference of norms. And note how her religion, she is from a Muslim background, is used to explain her objection. When a complaint is explained away, you are explained away. If you complain, you can end up reconfirming a judgment that has already been made, that you're not from here, that you do not belong here. A lesbian academic describes, if you have a situation, you make a complaint, then you are the woman who complains, a lesbian who complains. And then, of course, you get witch hunted, you get scapegoated, you become the troublesome uppity woman, you become the woman who does not fit, you become everything the bully accuses you of because nobody's listening to you. You can hear them saying, oh, there you go. Oh, there you go. We both laughed when she said this. The feminist killjoy comes up here. She comes up in what we can hear. We hear each other in the wear and the tear of the words we share, what it's like to come up against the same thing over and over again. We imagine the eyes rolling as if to say, well, she would say that. It was from experiences like this that I developed my equation, rolling eyes equals feminist pedagogy. We might laugh, we do laugh, I think we need to laugh, but we might also groan with recognition. If you're followed by rolling eyes, you're also being followed by eyes. In other words, when you stand out, you are the one who ends up under scrutiny, more and more scrutiny. So one time she was introduced by a student as a lesbian head of department. There was some discussion of that with colleagues, like I had some banner to fly, pushing students to get involved with this. Just being called a lesbian head of department can be heard as pushing an agenda. Some are judged as pushy, as imposing themselves, just by virtue of not being or doing more of the same. So it should not then surprise us that a pushy minority can morph into a bully, and members of her department then, in fact, submit an informal complaint about her to human resources, identifying her as a bully. So you can be called a bully just by being called or calling yourself a minority. So complaints as tools to redress bullying and harassment can be turned into tools to bully and to harass. This will not be surprising to feminist audiences. We are familiar with how the tools introduced to redress power relations can be used by those who benefit from them. I noted earlier how formal complaints can bring with them other more affective and embodied senses of complaint. Formal complaints can also end up being separated or detached from those who have a complaint to make because of what they experience. This is why it's so important not to tell the story of a complaint as a story of what happens to a formal complaint. We would miss too much. Formal complaints can, in fact, be redirected towards those who try to challenge abuses of power, those who desire or require a modification of an existing arrangement. So the complainer becomes, I think, of as a kind of complaint magnet. To become a complainer is to attract complaints, to receive them as well as to make them, or even to receive them because you make them. If you use the word race, for instance, you might be heard as complaining in the sense of being negative, destructive, but you're also more likely to be complained about. So the magnetism of the figure of the complainer has much to teach us about the directionality of violence. Violence can be redirected towards those who identify violence, and that redirection can be achieved through the very techniques we introduce to challenge the direction of violence. It's complex and complicated. The violence you complain about can be redirected towards you because you complain. A trans student of colour made a complaint about sexual harassment and transphobic harassment from their supervisor, who kept asking them deeply intrusive questions about their gender and genitals. Questions can be hammering. For some, to be is to be in question. These questions were laced in a language of concern for the student, for their welfare, predicated on judgments that they would be endangered if they conducted their research in their home country. Racist judgments are often about the location over there, in a black or brown elsewhere. Transphobic judgments are often about the location of danger in here, in the body of a trans person, as if to be trans is to incite the violence against you. Over there, in here, for trans people of colour, the point of intersectionality can be everywhere. When they complain, what happens? People were just trying to evaluate whether he was right to believe there'll be some sort of physical danger to me because of my gender identity, as if to say he was right to be concerned. The same intrusive questions that led you to complain are asked when you complain or because you complain. So much harassment today is enacted as a right to be concerned. We have a right to be concerned about immigration as citizens. We have a right to be concerned about sex-based rights as adult human females, and so on. A right to be concerned is how violence is enacted, a violence premised on suspicion that some are not who they say they are, that some have no right to be where they are, that some have no right to be. There are many ways we can be shut out from institutions, from categories of personhood, from ourselves even. One woman of colour describes her department as a revolving door. Women and minorities enter only to head right out again, whoosh, whoosh. We can be kept out by what we find out when we get in, or getting in can be how you're shown the way out. And yet consider how diversity is often imagined as an open door turned into a tagline, tag on, tag along, minorities welcome, come in, come in. Just because they welcome you, it doesn't mean they expect you to turn up. Remember that post box that had become a nest? There could have been another sign on the post box, birds welcome. Diversity is that sign. That sign will be what I called a non-performative, empty of force, if the post box was still in use, because the birds will be dislodged by the letters, a nest destroyed before it could be created. Those comments, we've been hearing them. Tone it down. Different ways you're told this is not your box, get back into your own box. Judgments made. He's right to be concerned. They function as the letters in the box. They can pile up until there's no room left. No room to breathe, to nest, to be. It's not enough to open a door or to be welcoming. For some, to be in that room requires stopping what usually happens in that room. Otherwise, they would be, as it were, displaced by the letters in the box. So if diversity is that sign, diversity covers over the materiality of dispossession. And so we also learn occupation and dispossession can be achieved by the same materials. A master's student begins her program with high hopes and expectations, and then it started. It started, I would say, in the second or third lesson I had with the professor. There were certain signs that rang alarm bells for me. My first reaction is stop being paranoid, stop being a feminazi where everything's gendered, you know. You're probably reading too much into this. You need to take a step back. The sound of an alarm bell announces a danger in the external world, even if you hear that sound inside your own head. We don't always take heed of what we hear. She starts by questioning herself rather than his behavior. She tells herself off. She even gives herself a talking to. In questioning herself, she also exercises violent stereotypes about feminists as feminazis, even though she herself identifies as a feminist. So these external judgments can be given voice inside one's own head as expressions of doubt. But she keeps noticing it, that the syllabus is occupied, how the syllabus is occupied. He left any thinker who wasn't a white man, essentially until the end of the course. He introduces the one woman thinker at the end of the course as not a very sophisticated thinker. She came to realize in time that her first impression that something was wrong was right. And then I was like, no, 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 no. Things are wrong, not just in terms of gender. Things are desperately wrong with the way he's teaching, full stop. When she realizes she was right to hear something was wrong, those no's come out. I think of all of those no's, all four of them, the sounds of an increasing confidence in her own judgment. So perhaps when those no's have been suppressed or held back, then when they're let out, more can come out. So the work you have to do to express no, to get the no out, is a very important part of the story of complaint. So a story of complaint can also be how you are received because of that no. In Living a Feminist Life, I describe sexism as received wisdom. And by that term, I was referring not only to content, but form. You're supposed to take it in, take the professor in, say, take the canon in, the curriculum, to ingest it, what he says, whatever he says. So when she tells him that she wants to write her essay for the course on gender and race, he says, if you write on those fucking topics, you are going to fucking fail my course. You haven't fucking understood anything I've been talking about if you think those are the correct questions for this course. So when you ask the wrong question, you can hear the violence of correction. But then he says, wait, you know what? you're so fucking old. Your grades don't really matter. You're not going to have a career in academia. So write whatever essay you wanted to write. You're going to fail, but it doesn't matter. She hears herself be written off. But she's afraid because no one else can hear it. Fear can be the experience of the absence of evidence. The complainer then becomes not only a nag, but also a hag. The feminist who's got the questions wrong, the old woman who might as well be wrong, who is too old for it to matter whether she got it wrong, because she can't proceed. She won't proceed. He won't let her proceed. In the end, she decides to make a formal complaint after her MA because she wanted to prevent other students from having to go through the same practice. So a complaint can be understood as what I think of as non-reproductive labour, the work you have to do to stop the reproduction of an inheritance. You have to stop the system from working. You have to throw a wrench in the works or become, to use Sarah Franklin's terms, a wench in the works. So what does she do? She starts by going to the course convener, who says to her, I hear a lot of these complaints every year, in an intonation that almost implied a yawn, as if to say, heard that before, been there, done that. She replies, if you hear them every year, why is it continuing? To complain is often to find out about other complaints, earlier complaints, to find out how they haven't been heard. She then receives a warning. Be careful, he is an important man. A warning can be a statement about who is important. So importance is not just a judgment, it's also a direction. Don't go there. She went there. She went ahead with a complaint. And in making that complaint, she, in her terms, sacrificed the references. In reference to the prospect of doing a PhD, which she had hoped to do, she said, that door is closed. That door is closed. References can be doors, how some are given a route through, how others are stopped from progressing. And when the door is closed on her complaint, and also on her, because she's not going to be there, bringing to the institution what she might have brought to the institution, the door is being kept open for him. And when the door is open for him, he can keep doing what it is he's been doing, where he's been doing it, behind closed doors. Complaint as feminist pedagogy. The system is working by stopping those who are trying to stop the system from working. That door is closed. It will be hard to point to a single action that closed the door on her and her complaint. Did the closing of the door begin with her indicating she wanted to write her essays on gender and race, what he calls the wrong topics? Did it begin by her questioning who was missing from the syllabus? Did it begin by sharing with the course leader that she had a problem with his teaching? These questions would locate the cause of the closed door in her own action. And that is how many closed doors are explained. We need to explain the closed door differently. Doors are teaching us about power and how power, even if it is not simply held, is being acquired. It is not only that the professor is holding the door, which he can shut on the student as penalty for complaint, although that is an important part of this story and many stories that I've collected. Consider who gave the warning, the lecturer who delivered the warning to the student. I learned that the lecturer was a new junior member of her department. She was far junior to the professor. For the door to be open for the lecturer, for her to be promoted at some future point, she would need the support of the professor, the most senior member of this department. So the door that she closes on the student's complaint and then on the student could be understood as the same door that she, as a junior lecturer, will need to go through. So the warning she gives could be a warning she herself has received about what she needs to avoid doing in order not to compromise her own trajectory, her passage up the organisation. So she might shut the door on the student's complaint to keep the door open for her own career. So doors can be deals. There is so much you cannot say or do, or at least that's what you're told, in order to have a path through or up the organisation. Complaint as feminist pedagogy. What you are told you need to do to move faster or further in the system is what reproduces the system. Doors can be deals. I communicated informally with a woman of colour academic. She told me how she'd given her support to a white feminist colleague who had made an informal complaint about plagiarism by a senior white man professor. She decided that she cannot speak publicly about the theft of her work by him. Her openness about it previously has apparently hurt his career. She fears it is hurting hers as she still needs him to be a reference for future jobs. So a complaint made public now becomes detached from one person, literally let go. And now it is still attached to a few others, but mainly me. So her white woman colleague lets the complaint go in order to keep the door open for her own career because she needs that reference from him. So yes, references can be doors, but the complaint does not go away or disappear entirely from the public realm. It gets stuck to her, a woman of colour academic. I suggested in my introduction that complaints can be treated as sticky data, but not everyone who makes a complaint will be stuck by them or with them. If some people can free themselves of their own complaints, unbecoming complainers, others will remain stuck with them. And by stuck, we're talking about a door being shut. So the door that is open for some is the same door being shut on others, the same door. We could tell the story of white liberal feminism as a story of the same door. We could tell the story of the white progressive institution as a story of that door too, the same door, the diversity door. People of colour are assumed to enter the diversity door however we enter the institution, and that door can be shut at any point. The door can be shut to stop some of us from getting in. The door can be shut because some of us get in. A black woman academic was being racially harassed and bullied by a white woman who was her head of department. I think what she wanted to do was to maintain her position as a director, and I was supposed to be some pleb, you know what I mean? She had to be the boss and I had to be the servant type of thing. That was how her particular version of white supremacy worked. So not just belittling my academic credentials and academic capabilities, but also belittling me in front of the students, belittling me in front of the administrators. How do you know it's about race? That's a question we often get asked. Racism is how we know it's about race, that war whiteness, or let's call it what it is, as she has, white supremacy. We come to know it intimately as it's what keeps coming up. To have got there, a black woman in a white institution, a lecturer, a senior lecturer on her way to becoming a professor, she is now a professor, is to be understood as getting above her station, above herself, ahead of herself. To belittle someone, to make them little, can function as a command, be little. And that command is being sent not only to her, but to those who are deemed to share the status of being subordinates, administrators and students. She said, when I told her I would like to work toward becoming a professor, she just laughed in my face. This is her head of department. That laughter can be the sound of a door being slammed. Some of us in becoming professors become trespassers. You're being told you need permission to enter by being told you do not have permission. So harassment does not just take place behind doors. It can also take place around doors, those doors we sometimes call promotion. I'm listening to an Indigenous woman academic. She tried to make a complaint after a senior white manager sabotaged her tenure case, as well as a tenure case of other Indigenous academics. When you are harassed and bullied, when doors are closed and they slammed, making it hard to get anywhere, it can be history you're up against, thrown up against. There is a genealogy of experience, a genealogy of consciousness in my body that is now at this stage traumatized beyond the capacity to go to the university. So there's a legacy genealogy, and I haven't really opened that door too widely as I have been so focused on my experience in the last 7 years. To be traumatized is to hold a history in a body. You can be easily shattered. There is only so much you can take on because there's only so much you can take in. But we can also inherit closed doors. A trauma can be inherited by being made inaccessible, or that has happened that was too hard or too painful to reveal. Decolonial feminist work, Black feminist work, feminists of colour work is often about opening these doors, the door to what came before, colonial as well as patriarchal legacies, harassment as a hardening of that history, a history of who gets to do what, of who is deemed entitled to what, of who is deemed entitled to whom. A complaint can be necessary, what you have to do to go on, but you still have to work out what you can take on. And she went on by taking them on. I took everything off my door, my posters, my activism, my pamphlets. I smudged everything all around the building. I knew I was going to war. I did a war ritual, now tradition. I pulled down the curtain, I pulled on a mask, my people, we have a mask. And I never opened my door for a year. I just let it be a crack. And only my students could come in. I would not let a single person come into my office who I had not already invited there for a whole year. Closing a door can sometimes be a survival strategy. She closes the door to the institution by withdrawing herself and her commitments from it. She still does her work. She still teaches her students. She uses the door to shut out what she can and who she can. She takes herself off the door. She depersonalizes it. And she pulls down the blinds and she pulls on a mask, the mask of her people, connecting her fight to the battles that came before. Because quite frankly, for her, this is a war. Our battles are not the same battles, but there are many battles happening behind closed doors. Behind closed doors, that is where most complaints will be found. So that is where you might find us too. Those of us for whom the institution is not built, what we bring with us, who we bring with us, the worlds that would not be here if some of us were not here, the data we hold, our bodies, our memories. Perhaps the more we have to spill, the tighter the hold, the more we have to spill. So many complaints end up in filing cabinets, filing as filing away. One student set off her complaint, it gets shoved in the box. Another says, I feel like my complaint has gone into the complaint graveyard. When a complaint is filed away or binned or buried, those who complain can end up feeling that they too have been filed away or binned or buried. Sometimes then, to get the materials out of there, we get out of there. When I made the reasons for my resignation public, in protest at the normalizing of sexual harassment, I shared information, not very much, but enough that there had even been these inquiries. And I became a leak, drip, drip. The university responded in the mode of damage limitation, treating the information that I shared as a mess. Sara, what a mess. But there is hope here because they cannot mop up all of the mess. A leak can be a lead. By becoming a leak, I became easier to find. People came to me with their complaints. That we find each other through complaint is a finding. Posting that letter was how I became part of a collective, a complaint collective. We are assembled before you. One lecturer who left the academy after her complaint did not get anywhere. It was she who likened complaint to a little bird scratching away at something, turned her resignation letter into a performance. I wrote a 2-page letter, and it was really important to me to put everything in there that I felt so that it was down on paper. And then I asked for a meeting with the dean. I kind of read the letter out in a performative kind of way, just to have some kind of event. We find ways to make those letters matter. We turn them into events. But she still wanted to do more. She wanted to put her letter on the wall of the corridor, so that everybody could see it. I just thought, I'm not the kind of person who'll put my resignation letter on the wall, but I just wonder, what it is that made me feel that I'm not that kind of person, because inside I am that kind of person. I just couldn't quite get it out. Perhaps that too is what complaints are about, how we help each other get it out. I think again of those scratches on the wall. They seem to show at first the limits of what we could accomplish, but they can also be what we leave behind. Complaint as testimony, complaint as how we get our letters onto the wall. It can take a collective effort to get the letters out. A disabled student was not getting anywhere with her complaint about the failure of the university to make reasonable accommodations. And then a file suddenly appears, a load of documents turned up in the student's union fax machine, and we don't know where they came from. They were historical documents about students who had to leave. So the documents included a handwritten letter to a human rights charity by a former student who had cancer and who was trying to get the university to let her finish her degree part-time. She speculates that a secretary was doing their own little bit of direct action, releasing these documents as a way of giving support to the complaint that she was not a secretary supposed to give. It's not surprising that a secretary can become a saboteur. Secretary derives from secrets. The secretary is a keeper of secrets. She knows where the secret files are. She knows how to get them out. I think about the student who wrote that letter. We can't know, and we won't know what happened to her, whether she got to finish her degree or not. But we can make her letter matter. And think of how if the student I spoke to hadn't made her complaint, that letter would have stayed put, dusty and buried. We can meet in an action without meeting in person. If direct action is required to get complaints out, then complaints can be a form of direct action. We can become complaint activists, making use of complaints within institutions to press against them. We can take up their time. The student herself applied what she learnt from complaining at the university to make complaints against other organisations for their failure to make reasonable adjustments. So if we learn about institutions from complaint, then we can apply what we learn. I have in fact learnt so much from the creativity of student-led complaint activism. A queer feminist student described to me their work to make violence more visible as the work of complaint. We complained through posters that there's gender discrimination. We performed complaint through spoken word poem recital. A complaint can be a poster, a performance, a poem, recital. They took on a role as student representative on a student committee that deals with complaints. So the complaints committee, that formal apparatus, can be one place where you do the work of complaint. The classroom can be another place. One time a professor made a deeply offensive statement in class. When they challenged a professor, they were asked to leave, but they stood their ground. Before I could complain, he complained. The complaint was addressed behind closed doors of other professors. We've learned to listen to the doors, listen to them as well as through them. They always have something to tell us. And that door is used to shut the violence in, and the student is made to apologise. But they kept complaining. The more you complain about, the more you are complained about. They became, in their words, a nuisance for the admin, an institutional killjoy, perhaps. To let complaints out, all that negativity, what a nuisance, is to become a complaint magnet, willingly, willfully. You make complaints knowing they'll come right back at you. But in the final year of their studies, they did not have the energy to continue to be complained about. And so they turned their complaints into a dissertation project. So many turnings, so many complaints. So complaint activism is not simply about using formal complaints procedures to press against institutions, although it involves that. It is also about finding ways to express our complaints on the walls, in the committees, in the classrooms, the dissertations, on the streets. Complaints can be expressed all over the place. They can be sneaky as well as leaky. I think of the work of getting complaints out from containers as also non-reproductive labour, because complaints are records. They teach us something, the truth even, the truth about violence, institutional violence, the violence directed towards those who identify violence, who say no to violence. There is so much violence in the containment of violence. We have to shatter that container. And when I think of that shattering, I hear the words of Audre Lorde. I could not have done this work without her work. As this is the last time I'm presenting this material before the book comes out, I want to acknowledge here my profound debt to Lorde. Lorde describes how she was driving in her car one time and she heard the news of a white policeman being acquitted for the murder of a black child. She stops the car to express how she felt. She stops the car and a poem comes out. From Lorde, I learned that sometimes to register the impact of violence, we have to stop what it is that we are doing. And then to express ourselves is not only to let the violence in, but to get it out. In the poem She Got Out, Power, published in The Black Unicorn, Lorde uses an image of what poetry is not, how poetry is not letting our power lie limp and useless as an unconnected wire. To get it out, the violence out, her words become electricity, electric, snap, snap, sizzle. She gets it out. She makes a connection. She keeps the connection alive. The more complaints are contained, the more we need to express them, to get them out, to keep them alive. The more we need to sneak, to leak, to leave trails behind us so that others can find us. After all, as we have learnt, a complaint in the present can lead to an unburial of past complaints. I think again of the complaint graveyard. I shared this image of one person that had been shared with me by another. You have to think about the impact of doing this, because having yet another complaint, it means that you give more credibility to the one who comes after you. When you talk about haunting, you were talking about the size of the graveyard, and I think this is important. Because when you have one tombstone, one lonely little ghost, it doesn't actually have any effect. You can have a nice, cute little cemetery outside your window, but when you start having a massive one, common graveyards and so on, it becomes something else. It becomes much harder to manage. We can and do form complaint collectives. We can and do become harder to manage, but we do not always assemble at the same time or in the same place. Can I address you now? You might feel like a lone little ghost right now. Your complaint might seem to have evaporated like steam, puff, puff. But your complaint can still be picked up and amplified by others. You might not be able to hear it now. It might not have happened yet. But those who come after you can receive something from you because of what you tried to do, even though you did not get through, even though you only seemed to scratch the surface. So there you are, little ghosts, little birds, scratching away at something, trying to create room from what has been scattered, shattered. It can just take a small opening, that tiny crack, for more to come out. No, 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 no. An army of no's. We are that army. A complaint can open the door to those who came before. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sara, indeed. Le doy las gracias a Sara, ¿no? por su charla.
I'd like to say thank you to Sara for her talk, all the different voices that she's mentioned, including that of Audre Lorde. We're going to continue now with our session. So I'm going to pass the floor over to Laura and Leire. Hello, everyone. Hello, Sarah. Well, first of all, we would like to thank our colleagues from Bulegoa Sembaki Barik and the Permanent Ordinary Seminar for the invitation to participate in this event. Both Leire and I are extremely grateful because this is a major challenge for us. I mean, you know, we're sharing a panel with Sara Ahmed. It's a rare honor, and we will do our utmost best to rise to the challenge. So what we've prepared, well, we've prepared what we like to call an experimental and diverse collage. That's the name we've given it because the next 20 minutes or so, we'll be reading a text that we've drafted together that reflects a whimsical random intersection of our individual experiences, thoughts, and ideas. So we'll be reading a text in two voices. First of all, we will introduce ourselves to give you a better idea of where we're coming from and to enable you to interpret what comes next. My name is Laura. I'm from Murcia, but I came to the Basque Country 6.5 years ago, and I'm still here, following my dreams. I'm an anthropologist, a feminist, a dyke, and I spend my days in academia, activism, and many other things besides. I love the sun. And among my many achievements, the latest was finally getting my driving license after 5 attempts. My doctoral thesis focuses on pleasure, specifically feminist practices around pleasure. I've complained a lot in my life, sometimes with very painful outcomes, but sometimes not so much. Hello, I'm Leire. I'm from Bilbao, but I live in San Sebastian. I'm a feminist and a firm supporter of Basque language and culture. I have a degree in fine art, and I've been working as head of education in the Centre for Contemporary Culture for 7 years. I'm an educator. I'm also a cultural manager and coordinator of a feminist program. I'm a total film buff. When I work, I always base my actions on critical feminist pedagogy. This makes things difficult sometimes, but I don't let that stop me. I've experienced many different situations in my work, and I've built relationships that go beyond the work environment with people who I would never otherwise have met, such as young migrants, for example. This experience is especially remarkable to me because it has prompted me to put into practice something we talk about all the time in theory, namely the idea of intersectionality with all its contradictions and paradoxes. Sarah's intervention was in English, and as you will have realized if you're listening to us directly in the original, Laura and I are going to switch between Basque and Spanish. Now, we're aware that some listeners may find this disconcerting, we stick by our decision. In this hybrid virtual, non-virtual world, it makes things a lot easier. It's not without its difficulties. And from a technical perspective, we've had to organize the interpreting service, which has been a bit of a headache for Sylvia and her colleagues. From a financial perspective, we've had to hire 3 interpreters. Thank you very much, by the way. And for the non-Basque speakers in the audience, I'm sure it's going to be uncomfortable to have to listen to what I'm saying through an interpreter. And I'm sure some of you are probably thinking, well, why not just speak in Spanish and have done with it? One less problem to deal with. But given that Basque is a subordinate language, we believed it was important to connect it to the topic we're discussing here today. We view the presence of a minority language side by side with 2 hegemonic languages, English and Spanish, as part of our narrative about complaint. And in this space, in which we're fighting alongside Sara Ahmed against the heteropatriarchy, capitalism, and colonialism, we believe that talking Basque makes more sense than ever. Things don't always have to be easy, and we don't always have to apologize. When do we complain? The silencing, harassment, and ostracism to which the institution condemns people who complain and speak up against an unjust situation is a starting point for our analysis, that thanks to Sara Ahmed. But power not only silences these types of more organized complaints, it also acts in a much more subtle way, embodied in the micro-institutions that we inhabit and in our day-to-day activities. Complaining isn't always organized in advance. It's not always a politically aware outburst of rage. It's not even a means of attracting attention. It can be any of these things. It can be all of them at once. But sometimes complaint is simply the only thing we can do to say, I can't take it anymore. It hurts. When I was 13 years old, I loved dressing up or dressing as a punk. I remember wearing light pink tights, a denim jacket, earrings and necklaces I'd stolen from my mother. So there I was, green spray in my hair, belt around my waist, strutting into the schoolyard, dead proud of myself. And on the covered side of the school playground, there was a kind of kiosk near the stairs, which was our territory. I went up to it, leaned on the bar, took out of my bum bag one of those Velcro wallets that were all the rage at the time and which all my fine arts friends are now searching desperately for in secondhand shops. I ordered an orange soda. They served it in a white plastic cup, slamming it down roughly in front of me. I took some pesetas from my wallet and paid. Coolest kid in town. Until I was 10, I'd go very quietly down to the playground during break. In this institution of control, where time was strictly regulated, it was time to enjoy supervised play with friends. I've always been a cheery person, and I like being with friends, so I really enjoy playtime. I remember the place where the first thing happened. It was on the covered side of the playground. If I were to draw a picture of the playground, you'd see straight away the areas that were ours, mainly corners, covered areas, stairs, never the center. So there we were on the covered side of the playground near the toilets. I don't know, probably playing skipping or French skipping or something like that. Perfectly happy. And that's when this guy came up. According to established gender rules, I guess he was pretty handsome, dark, brown eyes. But at that age, I was still too young to sexualize people. I later found out he was called Aritz. And it was a small gesture that he did. He simply came up to me and winked. I didn't understand why, and it made me uncomfortable. My memory has labeled his gaze as on fire. He winked with his eye, and went straight to my head. What did he want? And why was it so uncomfortable for me? I didn't really sexualize people before that moment, but it was clear to me, and it became increasingly so, that people would easily sexualize me as a girl. It wasn't just the comments I ever heard from my parents and other adults. It was something invisible that you could smell nonetheless, and something that told me that my body wasn't mine alone. I started experimenting sexually with myself pretty young. I've been masturbating since I was 8, but I didn't link that to sexual intercourse until much later. I just linked it to pleasure. The guy asked me something, my name or how old I was, I don't really remember. I think I was 10 or 11, I think, maybe 12. Anyway, he was 4 or 5 years older than me. His presence unnerved me. Paradoxically, this visual discomfort wasn't obvious to Aritz. I said no, time and time again, perhaps not in words, but definitely in body language, but he constructed in his mind a yes that never came out of my mouth. I was so naive that I decided to tell my teacher. Of course, I later regretted this decision, and I've never dared to complain about situations like this later in life again. But I talked to the teacher, and there was a massive uproar at school, mainly in Aritz's class, but also around me. And his classmates would come up to me saying, "But what did he actually do to you?" And I felt silly, ashamed, because when you really think about it, what exactly did Aritz do to me? Wink at me? That's nothing. What is a complaint? A complaint, a moan, a creak. The Spanish word for moan and creak are very similar. Something that creaks produces cracks. A crack is a groan that erupts in the middle of the system. A groan that is not released turns into a sigh. Sighing is a strategy of resistance used by those who complain without being able to complain. The Spanish word for complain, quejarse, comes from the Spanish huesare, which means to hit violently, to shake with force, to break. But what breaks? When we complain, we're breaking the social order. We're challenging peace, harmony, coexistence, good vibes. We want to break it because false happiness suffocates us, although in the end, the machinery ends up rolling right over us, breaking us, the complainers. Whiner, crybaby, whinger. According to the Royal Academy of the Spanish Language, it describes someone who complains too much, most of the time without proper cause. Now, taking advantage of our material immersion in translation, from English to Spanish and Basque and vice versa, Laura and I have thought about the translation of the word complaint. The English word can mean in Basque queja, complaint or moan, but it also can mean salaketa, which means accusation or formal complaint. Queja and denuncia in Spanish. I'd say that salaketa, formal complaint, is more institutional, whereas queja, Complaint is simple moaning, seems weaker and less serious, right? In French, the word is comprendre. Prendre in French leads us to the Spanish verb plañir, to wail or lament, and from there to the figure of the plañidera, women who were paid to go and cry at funerals, paid to complain, paid to cry and wail out loud, a respectable job. And all of them were women. And they shed the tears that no one else could shed, or perhaps they lent strength to other people's tears. I imagine them unleashing their innermost feelings at the burial of someone who didn't know how to wail, wailing their own pain and sorrow over the grave or over the very corpse of the dead person. Don't complain. When you spread your legs, you didn't complain. If you don't vote, you have no right to complain. The complaint is only valid, or the false promise is made, but it is valid if something is done later. Doing is the opposite of complaining. Doing is the opposite of weakness, because complaining shows weakness. You're not able to do what you're expected to do without complaining, without disturbing anyone, without making any noise, without making a fuss. Femininity is that, going through life without being noticed, doing the bed, the house, the children, work without complaining. So don't complain. You've got to work, you've got a job, don't complain. You've got a roof over your head, don't complain. You get ill or you get better, don't complain. I was going to meet Katalin for a press conference. It was supposed to be in a room in the cultural center, but when I get there, Kachi isn't happy. What happened? She's glaring at the cleaner. He's unbelievable, she says. I look at him. Oh shit, there's something about him that's bugged me for a while. He's a supervisor, and I've seen him treat the other suit cleaners very badly in the past. But now I think about it, he treats women especially badly. I've seen him at the office, deliberately exercising his power. The firm he works for describes itself as a company that, and I quote, creates and manages stable job opportunities specially adapted to people with reduced faculties and in particular those with intellectual disabilities in Gipuzkoa. Reduced faculties and intellectual disability, lack of ability. The main disability I can see here is that this guy is incapable of handling his power in a non-normative, non-sexist manner. You learn a lot about power in situations of abuse, and even more so when you make a formal complaint. And I think Sarah's made that abundantly clear. I talked to the production manager, but the complaint is not passed up the chain to the director. It's just personal, they say, and I don't understand why. I don't understand why they don't just kick him off the team. It's unlikely that his attitude will even be understood as a violent attack. And why is that? What attacks are legitimate? I mean, what attacks are socially understood as attacks? What attacks or abuses are unimportant? And how does that work in society's eyes? How does all that work? What's important, what isn't important? How does that work within the institutional framework? How can we make a complaint? How can we not break? Because breaking isn't good for us. Because we've learned all too early that if we complain, we're not good. We're not valid. We're not what we have to be. Productive, efficient, multi-orgasmic, and above all, normal. In other words, doing all that, producing, being efficient, having multiple orgasms, not drawing attention to ourselves. To complain is to realize and make others realize that we don't want to produce. We don't want to be efficient. We don't have all the orgasms we would like to have. It's to point upwards, towards that man who looks down on those who work for him, towards the mockery that pierces our bodies, and basically towards anything we want. Remember that complaining is linked to hitting something with anger, with violence. The fact that complainers are associated today with faint-heartedness is a question of power, of forced invisibility towards the person, the woman, who points out and denounces the privileges that ridicule complaint. Why do the hired mourners cry? Because somebody has to. Because other people perhaps didn't know, or because they couldn't? The important thing was that the mourner cried and her tears were pure complaint. She cried for the deaths she was paid to cry for. She carried on her shoulders the blows, the anguish, the rage. I meet with the head of security every month to talk about the situation with the general public in the building. We've been working with a group of young people for 4 years in the field of education, meeting every Friday to engage in various activities geared towards building a collective space. Many of the young people who come to the sessions are migrants. Some live in extremely vulnerable conditions in San Sebastian. And whenever I meet with the security manager, he always focuses on the behavior of these young migrants, these immigrants, even when I don't bring the subject up. He shows me pictures, and his Islamophobia is often very obvious. Look, Leire, he says, these 3 men came in. Look how they're dressed. They're wearing jiyabas. Oh, they talk to the youngsters, he says. And he says, oh, they were quite aggressive. I think they were recruiting them. So I called the police. And I say, well, hang on. Why are you so sure that's why they came? There might be another reason for it. Have you thought of that? It's Ramadan at the moment. I don't know, maybe did it occur to you that that might have changed the flow of people in the building? And why are the police in the building every day? And I ask him, and he says, well, it's on their rounds. But it's not only that, lady. Plainclothes National Guards and civil guards are here too, almost every day. And I say to him, yeah, I think sometimes there's a bit of racial profiling going on here. And he says, yeah, but we can't stop them coming in. And then one other time, he said to me, look, I'm going to show you a video. Is this young man one of yours? Is he one of yours? Is he one of the ones in your group? He looks like he's from the Maghreb. So he shows me the video and he says, look, he stole a backpack. So he shows me the video, but I can't actually see the face of the person in the video. So I say to him, how do you know he's from the Maghreb? You can't even see his face. 2 days later, I saw him again, the security manager, and I asked him, so did you find the bloke who stole the backpack? And he went, oh, yeah. Actually, he wasn't from the Maghreb in the end. It turns out he was from here. So we're talking about the secure space that we're trying to build. And we talk about sexism, we talk about violence. But there's another space which is very violent in itself and where violence is reproduced. And he says, how do you know this is racial profiling? I know they identify people, but that's just part of their job. So why do you think it's connected with race? Well, as Sara said, it's patently obvious. I think that institutions need to look inside. And they don't, sometimes because they don't have the motivation. As Sara said, some doors can't be opened. They remain closed or only half open. And I often ask myself, what happens? Are we actually trying to promote diversity, or do we just want a nice photo to upload to the social media? We want to give the impression that everything's fine, but it isn't always. As Sara said, when we complain, we expose ourselves to public scrutiny, to being judged in every way. The reason for our complaint, and above all, the people we are complaining about. If we don't succeed in breaking, violently hitting, or shaking the apparatus of power, it will do everything possible to ridicule us and subject us to public derision. Everything goes, ridiculing, satirizing, belittling. You pay a high price for complaining. But complaint is also one of the rights involved in political engagement. And given that attempts to ridicule and belittle those who complain often involve the feminization of behaviors linked to complaining, don't be a crybaby, for example, what we're faced with here is just another political strategy designed to expel non-hegemonic bodies from decision-making spaces and spaces of public participation. I'm having dinner with my family. I've just come from organizing a feminist seminar on violence. It's 2004. It's been a tough week. We're in Bilbao in a gentrified, trendy bar in the city centre. I'm knackered. My family start talking about something that happened in Vitoria-Gasteiz. A bus driver apparently stopped a woman wearing a burqa from getting on his bus, just for wearing a burqa. The argument makes me uncomfortable. Fatigue makes it hard for me to be articulate. Some are on the bus driver's side, others are on the other side, but the focus of the discussion itself seems a bit off to me. Violence penetrates my body deep within me. I feel blocked. My voice is gone. I'm quiet. And after that, I hardly speak. You're exhausted, aren't you, Leire? That's what they say to me when they hear that I'm not speaking. And how can I explain that this attitude, my attitude, has been caused by violence? When I'm with my family, it's harder for me to take on the role of disruptor. At work, I usually feel a lot more powerful when I'm playing that role, more legitimate. Somehow, in certain spaces, my body becomes a feminist and a censoring presence. But when we are transparent, people immediately see that we are uncomfortable just by the look on our face. And you act in one way or another, depending on how secure you feel in your mind or in that specific context. I relate my self-censorship when I'm with my family to the emotional ties I have to that space. But silence can also become an accusation. The body also accuses. My family understood something. My silence said something. The bodily presence of a feminist can stop an attack, even by its mere presence. To remain silent in response to a sexist joke, to not laugh, not to enable racism or sexism. Practicing pedagogy is tiring, and sometimes silence is your only weapon. And maybe that can be pedagogy too. The performativity of complaint with no words, just the body. We can think that this is closing the door. This door that we need not cross. Oh, I'm really poorly, but look, I don't complain at all. I'm feeling really poorly, but I'm not complaining. That's a phrase I've heard from women around me all my life. But it is perhaps in that non-complaint that the most forceful complaint emerges, the complaint of not being able to complain. It's a subtle kind of resistance, but it's one full of protest because what is glimpsed is the imposition of gender through which women do things without making a fuss of what they do, without reporting the abuse involved in doing so, without even having the right to express disagreement, discomfort, or anguish, without having the right to complain. It's also a warning, a notice that if we complain, the system which shores up the well-being of others towards whom the non-complaint is launched would crumble. It expresses the limits of the body, of their body, suffering in silence from constant attack. Sometimes when I need to complain, and I don't, my body is filled with psoriasis. My skin starts flaking because it's difficult to always capitulate, and not complaining is capitulating. And many people live like this and have perfect skin, but in a sense, I thank my body for making it so visible to me how irritating it is to keep the anger inside. So when it happens, every morning I shake off and then sweep up the flakes of my skin. And I mean this literally. Every morning I wake up to find my bed full of dead cells in the form of small white flakes, somewhat denser than dust. And every morning I shake the bed and sweep the floor. Every morning I shake myself off and sweep myself up. A bit of my dead self goes straight to the recycling bin every day. And in that purifying cleansing, there's something more than the ultra rapid regeneration of my cells. There's a shout, a cry, and I complain. Mohsin and I are talking about love. We're on a break from our Friday workshop. The year is 2018, and we're in the middle of recording a song with a band. The others are around somewhere rehearsing or recording their part of the song. There's something I've often thought about before today. This Friday space is a space traversed by race, class, gender, and other issues. I'm a white European woman, and they are the ones who have crossed a hidden border, in quotes, in search of a better life. But with regard to complaining together, to forming alliances between us in our subordinate states, I ask myself time and time again how we can move away from complaints that are well established in the identity struggle towards a more diverse space. Now, Mohsin told his love story that day, and then he asked me if I had a boyfriend, and I said no. I said no, I had a girlfriend instead. I said I was a dyke. In my country, that's illegal, he told me. Now, and up until then, I had kind of a weird fear about getting into conversations like this with this group of youngsters. I'd avoided the topic. I didn't want to be judged by them. I'm very privileged, particularly from a material perspective. I have a house and he doesn't. He has to sleep under a bridge. But we need to move away from our hang-ups about dichotomy and privilege because they're an obstacle to overcome. And in fact, having these types of conversations has been really useful to me. It's helped me to think about intersectionality. Rather than being constrained by privilege and trapped in discomfort, we need to find ways of activating privilege. We need to try and work on the basis of equality in a space that has no equality. We have to imagine ourselves to be subordinate together, each from their own situation and experience, and to believe that this gives us the power to complain together. Complaint, therefore, has many dimensions. There's the moan of physical pain, the pinching, cramping sensation that makes you shudder and that ends in a small or a loud scream, often accompanied by the interjection, ouch. And that ouch is full of meaning and embodies everything that the neoliberal system abhors, vulnerability. Collective, political, organized complaint is a political demand of vindication of vulnerability. Complaint as a means of resistance against capitalism and the neoliberal maxim of you can do it. Complaining together, or as we say in Basque, elkarrekin kexatu, maximizing the potential of the complaint is a political tool based on emotion, anger, and shared pleasure. Let's make complaining a pleasure. Let's complain about those who ridicule us for complaining. Let's be feminist, whinging killjoys, full of pride and joy. Let's complain. Let's annoy people by complaining. And let's enjoy it. Thank you very much. And before you clap, you're speaking in English, eh?
As Amparo said, Laura and myself, we organized a feminist festival. So we didn't want to go home without inviting you to Feminist Alia this year in November. We will email you, but just think it over and we will invite you to present your book.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you so much. It was wonderful to listen to your complaint biographies. It's a real privilege to be able to listen and to hear complaints as embodied, articulate political statements to the small sounds of a body that's not at home in an institution or a family. So it was really, really helpful and useful for me to hear that. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, merci, Laura y Leire.
So thank you very much, Laura and Leire.
Our audience asked question. Maybe you'd like to add something more to what Leire and Laura says, or would you prefer that we go straight ahead to the questions?
This is to me.
Yeah.
Well, I would be very happy for us to pick up in the questions some of the ways in which what you said and what I've said connects. And I didn't really present this so much here, but a really big important part of the project I've done is to try and think of complaint not only as an organized political action, but often also as non-intentional, as the experience that you might have of just having had too much or enough. And one of the instances, for example, in the book is where a woman who attempted to get an informal complaint out, it gets sat on and she's in a meeting and she gets another email from a professor who's harassing her and she just goes, oh, you know, she just can't take it anymore. She makes that sound and that sound alerts everyone to the fact that this is happening. And that is really, really strikes me. What's really interesting to me then is how when those little sounds, the sound of a body that is saying no, can become the occasion for institutionalized action. And it's quite interesting to think about how those spheres that might seem separate, a body making a small sound or a loud sound and organized action can actually be part of the same sphere. And I think for me, a lot of what the potential of feminism is actually that it is often those small moments of refusal, of saying no, or of not saying yes, or being heard as saying yes, being heard as saying yes because you don't say loud enough. They can be part of a kind of political project. They can be organized as a feminist collective. So I think that'd be one thing I'd pick up on. But I'd be very happy to answer some questions. I think we have some time.
Yeah.
Or you also questions addressed to any of us, all three of us.
Yeah, so I will lo voy a decir en español también y luego en inglés.
I'm going to speak in Spanish now. So I'm just going to repeat that. You can ask your questions through the chat function, or you can just raise your hand. If you are going to ask your question verbally, please turn your camera on and say who you are before you ask your question. She speaks switch to English as well. She's just repeating it.
And first of all, Sara, I would like just to thank you in the name of our many members of our research group who have been very moved for your talk, and we are really thankful, grateful for the words and the lectures you are giving for organize our complaint and our rage as well. So I didn't want to forget to say that. So mientras la gente puede estar empezando a pensarse las preguntas.
Okay, so while people think up their questions, I'm going to read out a question.
Making a complaint and the procedure required to attempt making a change is painful. For example, you might need to face the oppressor through mediation. Do you see options for change that don't require such an asymmetrical process?
That is a good question. I think what I would partly want to start with is the importance of having procedures, the acknowledgement that procedures, formal procedures, partly exist because there are power relations that would make it very difficult, if not impossible, for somebody who's in a subordinate position institutionally to actually challenge somebody who has more power. So procedures, like all equality laws really, they're intended to actually give you an institutional mechanism to allow redress. But as we've been hearing, they often fail to do so. Procedures become kind of like the master's tools, and they can indeed be painful for lots of reasons. It can be that you're required to keep making the same complaint. To testify to a trauma can be re-traumatizing. It might be that the procedure is atomizing. You're required to make the complaint on your own about an individual, when often actually the work of the complaint is often about a collective and the institution is often the problem. So there's many ways, or you might be required to go to mediation to meet the oppressor, as it were. And there are many instances where mediation is actually quite bad practice that I've included in my research. So I think it's important to acknowledge and to recognize the way in which the procedure can then become part of the trauma of the complaint. And I still think in a way, there's no way around it insofar as we need these formal mechanisms in hierarchical institutions. The best thing I would sort of suggest in terms of change is actually how we use the procedures. And I think that some of the people that I've learned the most from just talk to me just about how important it is to work collectively, even if the procedures are individuating, to hold on to the collective, to have a support system. Because actually, as I said, when you complain, you also find out about other complaints. So even if the procedures are atomizing, they can fail. They can fail in their attempt to stop you finding out about other people who share the complaint. And it's the process of sharing the complaint, the work of it, the labor of it, even the pain of it, that we get more of a sense of a sense of justice, a sense of agency in attempting to redress a problem. So I really think that's what I would focus on. It's not so much whether we can suspend the procedures. I think they're there because of the power inequalities, but rather we don't let the procedures determine the nature of the work. The work that we really do that matters is around the procedures. It's in the collective that we form, the collectives that we form that help us to change our relationship to the institution and often also ourselves. Thank you for the question, though. It's a very good question.
¿Alguna pregunta más para Sara, para Leire?
Is there any other questions for Sarah, or for Leire or Laura? I'm looking at the chat and doesn't seem to be any more questions there, at least.
Yes, this is one. Was there an instance where complaint stopped what was happening from happening? It is not the question, the need for action, but maybe there is a story when it just worked.
Yeah, there, without question, are examples of complaints that have stopped something from happening, or they've led to quite concrete institutional changes. They might lead to, in some cases, a removal of a harasser from a post, which is actually very unusual, but I do know cases of where that happens. I think what's difficult, I think what complaint often shows is to stop something from happening is no simple matter. Because often, for example, if your complaint is about harassment, it's not about one person. Usually it's about a whole network that enables that person, and then a whole institution that enables that network. So to actually stop something from happening sometimes ends up leading to the closure of a project or a program, and then the complainer often gets pathologized all the more as being the reason for the impossibility of that project or program. And in fact, often it's the fear that the complaint could lead to giving the institution resources to close programs that closes the doors on complaints. So it's very, very complex to work out the mechanisms of reproduction and how we can intervene in stopping something from happening. I know, for instance, there were examples where complaints have led to changes to the curriculum, where if people make complaints about sexism or racism, the curriculum changes have been made. But I've also got really interesting examples in my own research, which is limited. It's limited to the complaints that I heard about. It's not going to represent all complaints by everybody by any means. But there was one instance where she made a complaint about the sexism and racism in the curriculum, and then she found out that there was only, that is the story that I included today, she found out by complaining that there was only, I think there was 2 women included in the syllabus and they're both at the end of the course. She found out actually that there had been previous complaints, and that the women on the syllabus were only there because students had complained before about the masculinism of the syllabus. But she said to me that what it made her realise is that how those complaints had led to change, but in a kind of tokenistic way, so that you can actually modify the habit to keep the program. Like, it looks like you're modifying something, but actually you're keeping it by the appearance of modifying something. So sometimes we have to be very careful, because it can look like something has been stopped from happening, but it's just happening in a less explicit way. And that's why sort of when I'm thinking about non-reproductive labour, you're really thinking about something that's very long and that has longevity, because so often, you know, the work of feminism, if we imagine it as complaint against institution, leads to the introduction of new initiatives and new programs. Sometimes the rest of the university can go on as it was going on, which is obviously a problem. But we know that even when we create these programs and projects, they haven't become part of the everyday of the institution, and they can easily go. So you have to keep pushing to keep them going. And we know then that the things that get introduced that aren't about the same thing happening can stop happening. And I think that just sort of teaches us that the work of changing institutions is really, it's a long haul. And when I'm listening to the complaints, I'm trying not to think about it in terms of discrete complaints about this or about that, but thinking about complaints as kind of inheritance, a slow inheritance, the gradual process of trying to modify a history that has become so concrete, so embedded in the walls of the institution.
Okay, Sara, so we now have several questions here. I'm gonna read them all, and then you can answer to them if you wish. So first, Camila said, have you thought about analyzing the relationship between complaint and guilt and how it affects minority groups? And then Patricia says, I quit my job postdoc today, which is my form of complaint. I realize that's not an option for everyone, though. I'm really grateful for this space tonight. Gracias, and thank you. Gracias a todos, es que ricasco. And then there's a question in Spanish. I will try to translate it. From Dresda, she says how the complaint is related to evidence, and not only to evidence violence or to show violence, but with making us the marginalized, the people precare, testified about violence. And she thinks about the emotional tiredness, or the emotional ways of people, the emotional, how we can feel this emotion, affective tiredness of, because we are always the same, the people marginalized and precare who complain, who show evidence of this institutional violence. And the question is which ways of care, of self-care, do you recommend in order that our complaint, did you know in this how disgusted, so in this tiredness and this another one here, disgusted, was it just thank you, for Svetlana, thank you for your answer to her previous question. So you have these three questions.
Thank you for all those really great questions. I really appreciate them. Complaint and guilt. Yeah, I think it was really important to me in this project, you know, not to just make the project about formal complaints, the formal processes that you go through, but to think about complaint really, it's not the starting point even. To make a complaint, something has to have happened that you're complaining about. So complaints always take us back to something that has already happened. It's a way of going over what is not over. And a lot of the work of complaint is the work that you're doing before you even get to complaint. You're reaching it. And I think it was in that time, that messy, difficult time, when you're even just trying to recognize that something happened to you that you need to complain about, that something happened to you that's wrong. That's where a lot of feelings around shame and guilt have been expressed to me by people talking to me about their experience. And I think for a lot of people, you know, it's really hard to recognize harassment, especially if it's harassment from, say, a supervisor, partly because, you know, you're there to study. Recognizing the harassment is also recognizing all the work you need to do to get out of that situation. It's for many people also feeling implicated in the situation. What did I do to have let this happen, or what should have I done to have stopped this from happening? And that's exactly that the harassment doesn't feel like it's something you can separate from yourself. It becomes what you're stuck in, and to get out of it can often be really hard because you feel implicated in it. And I think feelings of shame, especially possibly more than guilt, have been expressed to me, that feeling that actually, in a way, to really fully acknowledge that the harassment has happened can be to have to come to terms with something about yourself. And people go through a lot of feelings of shame and guilt because they did recognize it sooner, they didn't do anything about it sooner, but sometimes I tell you later is as fucking soon as it can be when it comes to harassment, because it's never about one event. It's about things that happen over time and that accrue over time. But that feeling like, oh, I should have got it sooner, is very, very much shared from the people that have talked to me about harassment, particularly students who've talked to me about harassment by lecturers. So those feelings of complaint, guilt and shame, they're very, very entangled, and they make getting to complaint often incredibly hard work to do. You know, it's messy. It's very messy. That's very painful. The question about quitting, well, I kind of quit too. And in a way, when I resigned, that was when I first publicly was very explicit that this happened in the institution where I worked, and I was not going to put up with it. And I was not going to be silent about why I was resigning, if I was resigning to protest the silence that had been going on in the institution. So I think, you know, it's a significant number of the people I spoke to, and this includes students as well as academics, actually left the institution. So in their cases, they might have left because of a complaint. Like the complaint can often lead you to recognize something about the institution that makes you no longer want to work for it. That certainly has been the case for quite a few people. Or a complaint can lead to the destruction of the relationships that you would need to maintain ongoing working life in an institution. You lose your colleagues, the goodwill of your colleagues, for instance. Some people only complain when they know they've got somewhere else to go to, because that recognize that a complaint can do all of that. It can destroy the connections that you need to actually be somewhere. So that's sort of different than leaving as complaint. But I do think that for some people, letting go is a way of saying no. I won't do this. I will go somewhere. And I think what's really important is that, you know, if you leave, whether or not you make a complaint, if your leaving is a complaint, then you're leaving something behind you and you're taking something with you. And I think that's a really important thing to do. So congratulations. Care. I mentioned this idea quite early on, that I think of feminist counter-institutional work as housework. And that was partly just to place the feminist work in institutions right in them. It's ordinary, everyday housework that we're already doing because of the feminist roles that we have. But I said that part of that work is care work, and I associated care work with surviving institutions. That if we work to transform institutions, we still have to survive them. And I think a lot of, certainly a lot of the stories that I've been given are really painful stories of lives falling apart, not just working, you know, careers, in some cases careers really becoming more and more precarious, but actually lives, like everything falls apart because it completely takes over so much of your life. And so to work out how to survive that, I mean, firstly I should just qualify, of course, not complaining can also be disastrous and devastating, because the thing that you would complain about, if you could complain, remains. And many people also leave because they can't complain, but nor can they stay in the situations that they need to complain about. But if you do complain, you need to find ways to sustain yourself. And I think, you know, the answer I gave to what the other question, which was focusing really on procedures and their limits and how they can be re-traumatizing, was about complaint collectives. And in a way, I think complaint collectives is also how I think about care. That a lot of the work of complaint, when you're working with a group of people, is about sharing the load. And people sort of who formed collectives, like in the present, and there's, I think, at least 6 or 7 examples in my data where people actually worked as a group to get a complaint through the system. And a lot of people talked about, you know, actually partly it's kind of consciousness raising. You share stories, so this happened to me and this happened to you, and it's a way you gather more knowledge about the institution and its violences. But it's also about who gets to do what. So if you're working collectively, maybe somebody's good at writing emails, maybe somebody's really good at cooking dinners, maybe somebody's really good at mopping up tears, and you do things for each other to keep each other going. And I think it's those ordinary practices of getting to know people and knowing what they need, that's part of feminist labor around institutional change that really matters to me, I think.
Yes, definitely. So thank you very much. I'm sorry, because we still have some more intervention coming out, but we have to finish before 8, so tenemos que acabar antes de las 8.
So we have to finish before 8 o'clock. So I'm really sorry, it's a shame, because there are more questions. But we do have to finish. I'm going to pass the floor back to Miren and Bea, who are back there in Bulegoa, so that they can close the session. She's speaking in English.
Muchas gracias también a Miren y a...
She just said thank you. She did it really quickly, and then she switched back to Spanish. Thank you very much to Laura and Leire for your talk as well. Both of them very, very interesting.
Así podemos leer las intervenciones y las gracias. Adelante.
So we'll pass the floor over to our friend Antonio. Are you going to say something first? Yes, you can hear me. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to all participants. Thank you very much for the questions. I would like to echo what Amparo said. It's been extremely interesting. It's a wonderful way to finish this series of permanent ordinary seminars. So thank you very much. Thank you for inviting us. Thank you for working with us. Thank you to all the people who participated, who have enabled us to do what we like best, which is to come together with new people, to share our ideas, to think together about our everyday lives, everyday issues, because it's important to come together, to think about them, to find solutions together. It's important to do that collective work. So from our organization, we do hope that you have enjoyed it as much as we have. And we do hope to be able to continue to collaborate, continue to meet, hopefully without screens dividing us in the future. And I hope we will be able to continue to think about the collective work we can do, how to experience this collective work, how to approach it, how to address it, how to help each other, and to create these networks of support. We'd also like to tell you, just before we finish, and seeing as you're all here and we've got a captive audience, we have our next meeting of Sociología Ordinaria, which will be held on the 16th of June. We will be streaming the event. For those of you who can't be there in person, there are a number of different problems this year. You know, there's been a pandemic, in case you hadn't noticed. We've had to change our format. So we've now got a short program about contact, to think about this whole idea of being in contact, skin against skin, different types of connections and contact, which has a political element. Touching us, not touching us. We want people to touch us. We don't want people to touch us, touching ourselves. And all of this in the current context of the pandemic, of social distancing, but also from a cross-cutting perspective as well. So how do we want to come together, to meet together? How do we want to continue to work together? And it's important seeing as you're all here, we would like to share this invitation to all of you. I know we have to finish. I don't want to go on for too long, so I will finish now, I promise. Just by, you know, giving a bit of publicity. Here's our blog. Please visit our website, sociologiaordinaria.com. So here you have our ideas, what we propose, and here you see the seminar program, 16th of June. As you can see, we're going to be talking about tangent practices and perverted learning, and that's going to be Beatriz Cavia who's going to be kicking off the session. And anyway, that's just a sneak preview. We do hope to see you all on the 16th of June. Thank you very much, Antonio. Well, I'd like to thank all our guests, Laura, Leire, Sara, of course. Thank you so much. And Carmen Romero, who's asked a question actually, but unfortunately, we didn't have time to answer it, but thank you for her for asking the question nevertheless. Thank you to all participants who've been connecting up from different parts of the world. And I don't think I've forgotten anyone. And of course, we have to thank Sociología Ordinaria, Amparo, Antonio, Elena. Thank you very much. I know we've said thank you time and time again, but it is such a pleasure to work with you, and we hope to work with you more in the future. And just to finish, I'd like to thank Silvia and Javi, our technicians, for their fantastic work. They've really made all this possible, and we're very, very grateful to them.